It was a French-sounding voice.
I don't know anybody in D.C., so I didn't answer it.
It was May 4th that I got the phone call, so for all of us Star Wars fans, may the 4th be with you.
I said, are you serious?
So I've gotten 3 calls from the nuncio. I think that's enough in one lifetime, by the way.
I think every bishop has a story about that.
I received the call from the nuncio after a 30-mile bike ride.
My jaw dropped and there was silence for a while.
My heart sunk. And then I thought, I can't call the papal nuncio from the parking lot of Alfredo's Pizza.
So you're voluntold.
I said to him, "Are you sure?"
I thought that it might be a scam.
Who is this? Who's playing a joke on me?
And he said, well, pull over, because I'm not going to talk to you until you are pulled over and stopped.
I was shocked, so I said yes.
When I saw the Washington, D.C. number, I thought it was one of those calls saying you could extend your warranty.
It was all in Spanish, which caught me off guard.
I honestly was so overwhelmed. I was flabbergasted.
He's not calling to ask about the Vikings. He's not calling to ask about the weather in Minnesota.
I couldn't hear him very well.
I said, redemptorists don't become bishops.
I looked down at the phone. I thought, well, I don't know anybody in Washington, so I didn't pick up the phone.
So I was a COVID bishop. It was May 4th that I got the phone call, so for all of us Star Wars fans, may the 4th be with you. It was a Monday morning, and it was the parish, so much of the world was shut down at that point, so the parish was shut down. I had a meeting scheduled with my staff at 9 o'clock on Zoom. And for a change of scenery, I decided to leave the rectory and go to my office. Was going to have that meeting from there. And it was about 8:30 in the morning. I was the only person in the building, and I had gone to make a cup of coffee and get ready for the meeting. As I walked back into my office from our little break room, my phone was ringing, which was, my cell phone was ringing, which I had set on my desk. And I went over to the phone and I picked it up and I looked and it said Washington, D.C., with a cell phone number. And I actually went to put the phone down because 5 months prior to becoming a bishop, I had bought a new car. It was time to get a new car. And so the day after Christmas in 2019, I went shopping and bought my new car. And from January on, after I got my new car, I kept getting calls from marketers saying that I could extend the warranty on my old car. And many of those calls came from Washington, D.C. So when I saw the Washington, D.C. number, I thought it was one of those calls saying you can extend your warranty. And so I went to put the phone down, and yet something inside said no answer. And I looked at the phone again, and then I answered the phone, and it was an interesting conversation. Archbishop Pierre at the time said hello, and his first words to me was, "How's your health?" And I thought, this is an odd way to begin a conversation, especially when I don't know who you are, And I said, "Excuse me?" And he said, "Your health in the pandemic, how is your health?" And I said, "Oh, it's fine." And then he told me who he was and told me of the news.
So I had just come from a cemetery, a very sad experience. We lost one of our parishioners to COVID. And I came into the parish office and my cell phone rang. And I usually don't answer numbers that I don't recognize, but because it was the pandemic, all kinds of people were calling with needs for food, needs to get to hospital, just words of encouragement and prayer. And so I answered, and it was all in Spanish, which caught me off guard at first, and said that this is the nuncio. Are you Bruce Lewandowski? I said, yes. I think it's all in Spanish. Actually, the nuncio said, you speak Spanish very well. I said, oh, thanks. And then he said, I'm calling to let you know that you have been nominated an auxiliary bishop in the Archdiocese of Baltimore. And right away, I was just silent. I didn't know how to respond, what to say. I said, are you serious? I said, redemptorists don't become bishops. And I said to him, our founder, St. Alphonsus, became a bishop, and he discouraged us from accepting titles, honors, any kinds of positions or status, and he certainly wouldn't want us to be a bishop. And so his response to me was, the Holy Father is the highest authority, and he wants you to be a bishop. Do you accept? So I said, well, if the Holy Father wants it, he must need me for something, so I'm yours.
Yeah, the call from the nuncio, there's always interesting stories about that, and mine was I was celebrating my dad's birthday at Alfredo's Pizza, which some people might recognize from the TV show The Office. Being from Scranton, my mom and dad typically go to Mass, and on this Monday, it was December 13th, and I said, I'll join you after Mass, because I was in a parish a couple miles away. Joined them at Alfredo's Pizza with my godmother and a few cousins that were there. Just kind of a typical thing that we would do, get together and celebrate my dad's birthday, have pizza. And the phone rang in my pocket, and I looked at it. It was from Washington, D.C. I said, I don't know anybody in Washington, D.C. that I know of, so I put it back in who would be calling me. So I put it back in my pocket, finished the meal, go into the parking lot, listened to the voicemail that was left from that number that called me, and it was Archbishop Pierre. My heart sunk. And then I thought, I can't call the Archbishop, the Papal Nuncio, from the parking lot of Alfredo's Pizza. I've got to go somewhere where I have more of a recollected mind. And so my heart was racing, and I drove to a place that had an overlook of the valley near where I was serving as a priest in Carbondale, Pennsylvania. I called him, and then he wasn't there. So I thought, let's be a couple days before he gets back to me. He's probably a very busy man. So I drive down to my parish, again, still with my mind racing, and I pull into the driveway, looking at an image of the Blessed Mother right in front of me, and he calls. And so I'm talking to him on the phone while I'm looking at the Blessed Mother, and he starts with a few cordial kind of, how's your mom, how's your parish, and then Pope Francis has appointed you Bishop of Gaylord. I knew something significant was going to likely happen in that conversation. But when that happened, I was really reeling and really not understanding how something like this was happening to me. And the funny thing about the conversation, though, was he said, do you know where Gaylord is? And I really had never heard of Gaylord, Michigan before. I'm sure, like many people in Gaylord, never heard of Scranton, Pennsylvania either. So I fumbled, and the first thing that came to my mind was, I said, Archbishop, is that in Texas? So he starts laughing, and then he just puts me at ease by telling me a little bit about the diocese and some of the protocol that was going to be followed. And the hardest part of that, of which is keeping it quiet from family and others. You have to sit with it for a while. You could tell your spiritual director, but I was blessed also in this circumstance to be able to share it with my bishop, Bishop Joseph Bambera of Scranton, and he was a great help to me. And just something that took a while to process, and that phone call still is as vivid in my mind today as it was the day he called.
Well, it was the craziest couple of moments of my life. There's a whole story involved with that. I initially got a voicemail, and it was a French-sounding voice, and I didn't know Archbishop Pierre at the time. I'd never met him. So when he said he wanted me to have a conversation with me, to call him back, I thought that it might be a scam, which I know sounds kind of funny, but that's what I thought it might be. So I came up with a plan. My plan was, if I called him back and he asked me for money for a charity, I might have been a little skeptical, and I was going to say, well, I'd like to check that out with Archbishop Broglio, because he's the military archbishop. He's my archbishop. So I thought that was a reasonable plan. But before I got a chance to call him back, I got a text message from Archbishop Broglio saying that if I needed to talk, to call him. I now knew it wasn't a scam, but I didn't know what it was about. When I called Archbishop Pierre, and he said to me that the Holy Father had appointed me to be an auxiliary bishop, I honestly was so overwhelmed. I was flabbergasted. So I don't remember what I initially said, but he then asked me a second time if I accepted. And so I said, can I think about it? Can I pray about it? Can I call Archbishop Broglio? And can I call you tomorrow? I thought they were 4 good questions. So he asked me a third time, Father Coffey, do you accept? And I really prayed hard at that moment. I prayed for wisdom because I was a little bit overwhelmed by the thought of it all. And I prayed to the Lord to give me a good answer. And at that moment, it came to me, St. Francis de Sales said, seek nothing, refuse nothing. And that gave me peace. So I said, I accept. And that was in January of 2019.
The first time I was asked to be a bishop, it's sort of a proposal by the nuncio, would you accept? And I said yes. I was already kind of in that mode as a vicar general, vicar for clergy, and so on. But then I learned when I became bishop of Phoenix that it wasn't an ask, it was you are appointed. So you're voluntold. And I was happy to accept it regardless.
The thing I remember is the fact that when the nuncio called me, I thought that he was calling me to tell me who the bishop would be that would be coming, because I was the administrator of the diocese at the time. And when he told me that he was calling to tell me that I would be the bishop of Allentown, I said to him, "Are you sure? Because I'm actually a priest of the Diocese of Allentown." And he said, yes, we're very sure. And that stuck out in my mind that it was a light moment, but it was a moment of great grace and in many ways a time to reflect on the obedience that God calls us to.
Yeah, I was shocked to get the call. I never expected to be a bishop. I was planning on going back to the diocese from the St. Charles Seminary, where I was on the faculty, and I had been away from a parish priest, being a parish priest for about 10 years. I got the call knowing I was coming to the completion of my term as Director of Spiritual Formation at St. Charles, and so forth. He called, and I didn't really have a lot of time to think about it. I was shocked, so I said yes. And then Archbishop Wilton Gregory from Atlanta at that time called and thanked me for saying yes. And then Bishop Burbage from my previous bishop in Raleigh, but now in Arlington, he called and said congratulations and so forth. And then the Diocese of Raleigh, my home diocese, called and gave me my parish assignment, which I was waiting for. So I had 2 assignments in one day, and I said yes to both of them because I couldn't tell them I wasn't going back to Raleigh. Yeah.
I was actually on my way back to my parish. I'd had a funeral in another parish and was in my car. Phone call comes up on the dash. It says a DC number. So I thought, I don't really know anyone in DC, but maybe I should take this call. So I did. I immediately recognized Cardinal Pierre's voice because I'd met him a little bit before. And he asked me if I was alone and if we could talk. I said, well, I'm alone. I'm in my car. And he said, well, pull over because I'm not going to talk to you until you are pulled over and stopped. Took me a couple of minutes to get through an intersection, pulled over, and he said, Pope Francis has named you as the coadjutor bishop of the diocese next door, Great Falls Billings. Do you accept? After I caught my breath, I said yes, and we chatted just for a couple moments longer, and I literally had to get back to the parish because it was the Saturday of Palm Sunday, and Mass was ready to start in 45 minutes. So not quite sure how I made it through that Mass, but I did.
The day that I received the call from the nuncio was December 18th, and I remember distinctly, as a lot of men would, what they were doing. I was watching football, and it was a Sunday afternoon at 1 o'clock. I had a guest over at the rectory. At 1 o'clock, the phone rang from D.C., and we had just sat down, eating lunch, watching football, and I decided, I don't know anybody in D.C., so I didn't answer it. And exactly 15 minutes later, it rang again. And whatever moved me to think, well, this might be something more important, or it might not be a telemarketer, I picked it up. And as soon as I heard his voice, I was concerned, I guess would be one word to use. Had that happened 5 years later, I wouldn't have known the significance of the Apostolic Nuncio. But as you know, you've talked with Bishop Joseph Williams, a friend of mine who had got the call just about a year earlier, and I had heard his story, and I'm like, oh no, this is why the nuncio calls. He's not calling to ask about the Vikings. He's not calling to ask about the weather in Minnesota. So his first words, after maybe 5 seconds of small talk, was, the Holy Father has appointed you to be the next auxiliary bishop of St. Paul, Minneapolis. Do you accept? And when Bishop Joseph told that story, he mentioned how he asked, how does this work? What's the protocol? Do I pray about it and call you back? And the nuncio, who's from France, said, no, you say yes, and then you pray. So that had always been so funny, but it wasn't so funny on that day. But I recapped that conversation with the nuncio, and he basically said, yeah, that's still how it works. So as much as I never thought I would get the call, never thought of myself as bishop material, I also would have never seen myself saying no to the church. So I said yes, and I went back to watching football, even though you would think I'd go pray, but I had this friend over, and so I had to carefully get him out of the house, and then I went to the chapel.
I'm often asked what the experience was like to learn that Pope Francis had appointed me the bishop of the Byzantine Catholic Eparchy of Parma. Compared to other bishops who I've talked to about this experience, mine seems a little bit different. Our particular Byzantine Catholic Church in America is its own metropolitan church, what canon law calls a metropolitan church sui juris. And the head of our church in America is our Metropolitan Archbishop. He's the Archbishop of Pittsburgh. And at the time that I was called to this new ministry, I was serving as the rector of the Byzantine Catholic Seminary in Pittsburgh, and the Archbishop's residence was next door. And I think he texted me and said, "How about dinner?" And sounded good to me. And when I went over to his residence to prepare to go out to dinner, he gestured me in somewhat of an unusual way and said, "Sit down," and pretty quickly got right down to the point that Pope Francis had appointed me the Bishop of Parma. And my jaw dropped, and there was silence for a while. And then soon on the phone, we had the Bishop of Passaic, who was the administrator, the apostolic administrator of the Eparchy of Parma. So I would be succeeding him in a sense. We had him on the phone in the nunciature's office as well. I thought I would have somewhat of a choice in the matter, but basically what I quickly learned is this is what the Holy Father has called you to do. Your job is to be obedient. And so I had a night for some prayer and reflection, and I called back the nunciature's office the next morning and certainly agreed to what the Holy Father had called me to.
I think every bishop has a story about that. For me, it was quite something. It took me obviously totally by surprise. I was vesting for Mass, and now Cardinal Gregory, then Archbishop Gregory, was near me, and I was talking with him. We were 5 minutes away from having this Mass begin, and my phone went off. I saw it was a 202 number from Washington. Our Marist headquarters are in Washington, so I thought, well, maybe it's somebody calling from our provincial headquarters. Turned out to be the nuncio. I couldn't hear him very well. Archbishop said, "Take this call somewhere else where you can hear." I thought, well, that's interesting. So finally, the nuncio, I could understand what he was asking, and I was shocked. And so I told him I was a little concerned about the school that I was the principal at, because we had just lost our president 3 months before, and I was worried about what would happen to the school. He didn't miss a beat. He said, "Well, you have to believe that a school that's named for the Blessed Mother will be taken care of by the Blessed Mother." And I said, "Yes, you're right. I do have to believe that. So what do you want me to tell the Holy Father?" Tell him yes, because Mass is beginning in a minute or two, and I have to be going, and that's probably what I'm going to answer anyway. So there we are. Yeah.
So I've gotten 3 calls from the nuncio. I think that's enough in one lifetime, by the way. So, but the first call and the second, I was both of them. I was driving, so it was very just completely out of the blue, a surprise. The first time was mostly shock. The second time, I had been an auxiliary bishop for a couple of years, and the thought of having a diocese, it was exciting. It was exciting and a beautiful thing to imagine going to Providence and kind of trying to be pastor in a sense, in a way that I hadn't been before as a bishop. This third call to Boston was a little more daunting. I had really come to love the Diocese of Providence very deeply. I felt very loved by the people there. So when the nuncio called me, my honest first reaction was a sense of loss. But I'm a man of obedience and of the church. I accepted that. I opened my heart to that. And I've always, when we do that, when we give ourselves over to God's will, then the graces flow. And I already see that happening in Boston. And I feel now very excited about ministry there and the people with whom I'll share that ministry.
I received the call from the nuncio after a 30-mile bike ride, and I had just arrived home. I was in north of Orlando in one of the suburbs in my parish in the rectory, and I saw that the nuncio was calling. Well, I didn't know it was the nuncio, but it was a 202 number, and I did answer the call. He asked how I was and how was my day going. I told him I just finished a 30-mile bike ride, and then we chatted for a few moments. He had met me. We had met once before at, I believe, my brother's installation as Bishop of St. Petersburg. And, we talked for a little bit, and I kind of thought, I don't think he's calling to find out what the weather is like in Florida on this particular day in early July. And he just came right out and said, "The Holy Father has appointed you as Bishop of Savannah." And I said, "Savannah?" And he said, "Yes, it's near Orlando." which it's only 4.5 hours away, so it is kind of near to Orlando. And we chatted for a little bit further about that. I asked a couple of questions, and he said, well, what do you say? And do you accept it? And I said, yes. And I'm very grateful that I did.
You know, the first time when I was named an auxiliary bishop in Detroit, I was meeting with my spiritual director when the first call came in. Actually, we were having a couple of beers together. And I looked down at the phone. I thought, well, I don't know anybody in Washington, so I didn't pick up the phone. The next morning, as I was coming back after Mass from breakfast, again, this phone number appeared. And I thought, well, I better answer this phone. And on it was was Cardinal Pierre, the nuncio to the United States. And he began to laugh. And he asked, you know, if I was who I am. And I said yes, and he said, you know, he introduced himself and laughingly said, the Holy Father has appointed you as an auxiliary bishop of the Archdiocese of Detroit. Well, to be honest with you, I thought it was a crank from one of my friends. I have friends like that who would do that, and a little while later, the Archbishop of Detroit, Archbishop Alan Vigneron, called, and I said, is this real? And he said, oh, believe me, it's very real. So there was that. The second time that the Archbishop, Cardinal Archbishop, called me, I was helping out in a parish. The pastor had actually neglected to get coverage for his Sunday Masses, and so I was pinch hitting for him. And between Masses, my phone rang again. And I looked down, and this time I knew it was the nuncio's number. And I guess my first thought was, oh, no. And I went to pick up the phone, and it dropped. And then the second, he called right back. And again, I tried to answer the phone, and it dropped. And I was really grateful because I didn't want to go into celebrating the next Mass with that kind of weighty news on me. And so when I got home back to my house, he called the third time. And this time he told me the Holy Father had appointed me as Bishop of the Cross. The first thing in my mind was, where's La Crosse? And the second thing was, I didn't know La Crosse was open because, you know, we do our own calculus and look at what seas are open and whether we'd like to go there. That's not too important because the Holy Spirit and the Holy Father have other plans of their own. But I talked to Cardinal Pierre, and he was very kind and told me of the Holy Father's intention. I hung up with him, and I realized that wherever Jesus was, that would be my home. And so I happily said yes and happily went to La Crosse.
You know, it's one of those life-changing moments, getting a call from the nuncio when, believe it or not, it was Monday of Holy Week. I've since asked the nuncio if he ever needs to make that call, try and stay clear of Holy Week. But there was a lot going on in that moment, but I have to admit that there was some tremendous joy in realizing that the Holy Father had asked me to be the Bishop of Charlotte, and also a lot of fear. I mean, not necessarily sure that I was the guy or that I was capable of doing what the Holy Father was asking, but trusting in him and trusting in the nuncio.
The call from the nuncio was, I'm embarrassed to say, I left my phone in my car during a meeting at our seminary. And throughout the meeting, the Cardinal, during breaks, kept coming near me and looking at me like he was waiting for me to tell him something. And I just thought that was very strange, and I didn't know what he was up to. But I finally got back to my car, and the phone was ringing, and it was the nuncio. And I'm listening to him say this remarkable thing that I never, ever expected. And the very first thought that came to mind was, who is this? Who's playing a joke on me? So much so that I was distracted in what he was saying to me, and I had to ask him, Your Excellency, could you please repeat what you just said? And he laughed. He laughed, and he graciously repeated what he said. And he said, "Do you accept?" And I said, "My goodness, what a question, out of the blue." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Of course you do. Of course you do." So I asked if I had permission, because you're under the seal, can't say anything. I asked permission to talk to the Cardinal, and he gave me that permission. And I went back to the seminary, and he was still there, thank God. And I looked at him. All I did was look at him. And he came over, and he gave me a big hug. And I was very grateful, very stunned. But I have to admit to you that I kind of broke the seal, because in the days that passed, I went to the cemetery where my parents and my grandparents and my aunts and uncles are all buried. And I went grave to grave, and I told them. And they probably knew. But that was a very emotional moment. So it was really a very powerful time. And I'm very grateful.